I'd like to start out by asking you what first drew your attention to Calvin Coolidge?
Well, I'm a New Englander. I grew up in Massachusetts, where I now live, and only 10 miles from Northampton, which is where Coolidge had his start in politics. So I grew up more or less being aware that Calvin Coolidge had existed. I never met him, of course. He went to Amherst College, which turns out to be where I went to college. And as I recall, during my time there, a portrait of Coolidge was prominently displayed in the college's main convocation hall, the college chapel. So again, I had that awareness. And then thirdly, I was a history major, American history major at Amherst, and then went on to get my doctorate in history at Harvard. And so again, just as part of learning about American history, I knew something about Calvin Coolidge. It wasn't some in depth necessarily, but it was an awareness. And then a little later in my professional career, I was commissioned to write a biography of Herbert Hoover for the Hoover Presidential Library Association, as it was then called. And that's something like the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation for Coolidge. And in the course of writing some volumes actually about Herbert Hoover, I necessarily became aware of Calvin Coolidge because Hoover worked for President Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce. And so I've had occasion to write an article about the Hoover-Coolidge relationship. So in that kind of roundabout way, though not being a Coolidge specialist, I have developed an interest in, as well as some professional writing about Coolidge, and have come to admire him very much.
Yeah. So what is the theme of your remarks at the conference?
Well, this morning I was part of a panel devoted to the progressive era and Coolidge's place in it. So I gave a talk on Coolidge during that period, including his political career, which began in 1906 as a state representative in Massachusetts and went up the ladder to being governor, all this before he was vice president and president. And during that period, Coolidge was something of a progressive. He was a regular Republican, but he had a progressive streak, which is not usually recognized by historians, especially historians of some time past. And so my discussion was to look at how he succeeded as a politician in a very unstable political environment, with parties being divided and so on. And I said that one of the answers was that he survived as a progressive in the progressive era because he was in part a progressive. But he was also, and became more as time went by, more conservative. And that too was helpful to him. So he was not a character who just had one soundbite and that was all he ever stood for, you see. So he had a considerable career that doesn't quite fit some of the lingering stereotypes about him. And I found that very interesting, and that was what I was asked really to address.
And kind of in that vein, is there anything important about Coolidge that you may not have had a chance to say in your public remarks at the conference?
Well, I think one point that I made a couple of times, but I did not elaborate greatly on, was why was Coolidge so popular with people who would seem to be outside of his ordinary range of politics? He was a New England Yankee. He was living in a state which, during the time he was in politics, was heavily influenced by immigration from abroad and by some strikes in the mills. Massachusetts was full of factories and mills in those days, and the newer immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe were mill workers. And here's Coolidge, this old New England, laconic, taciturn, undemonstrative Yankee. How did he connect with them? Because what became evident in my research is that he didn't just get Republicans to vote for him of the old lying WASP variety, but he also appealed to some extent to these newer ethnic immigrant groups. And I think there are a couple of answers to that question, which I touched on, but can just indicate a little more fully now. One was that he had a very unusual political persona. Most politicians are thought of as people who shake hands all the time, happy to give speeches at the drop of a hat, maybe bloviators or performative types. Coolidge was not. He was notoriously taciturn, Silent Cal, as he got as a nickname, and he, however, exuded a seriousness and conscientiousness about his duties that I think people instinctively recognized that here was a man who wasn't just tossing out talking points. He had a comprehension of his duties and of the issues, and he presented them in a very crisp, readable, understandable style. And so I think some of his personal qualities made people think well of him, thought, this is a man I can trust. We can see he's doing his best for the people. And secondly, he was attentive to the needs of people in the mills, that is, health conditions in the factories, minimum wages, minimum hours, and he proposed some progressive legislation for the state of Massachusetts, and notably a law that restricted the number of hours that any woman or person under 18 could work. And so that was considered to be an advance, a social advance. And so he did things that people could say, oh, he's not in the pocket of some wealthy capitalist like that. He is a man who reaches across some of the boundaries. Now, he was conservative fiscally and in his general lifestyle, you could say, but he did have that progressive streak. So I think part of the secret of Coolidge's success lies in the fact that he was so contrary to the usual politician in style, so that made people kind of curious about him. It was kind of effective in reverse, you might say. He wasn't up there pounding away in the platform. He said what he said and sat down, And then secondly, because I think he had a rural middle class background, he was not a wealthy man. He was never one that would be thought of as condescending to the poor or to the laboring classes. And that got across by his demeanor and some of his stands. So that I've now elaborated as a side of Coolidge that is not generally remembered. I think after this conference it will be better understood as more recent historians have discovered that Coolidge was not the stereotypical character that some people like to make fun of once upon a time.
Yeah. And have you learned anything at the conference that you think needs to be emphasized in Coolidge's centennial year?
Well, I think that points that have been made by the other two panels so far have produced some thoughts for me. And one of the speakers pointed out how some of the progressives like Woodrow Wilson really were not progressive in ways that we would now applaud. In contrast to Coolidge. Coolidge was a big believer in women's suffrage. And this is at a time when Woodrow Wilson, right through his presidency until just about the end, was not in favor of, and many Southerners did not support that. And so I knew that going in, and yet I knew it about Coolidge, but to see it presented in contrast to Wilson, who is usually held up as the great progressive of that period, and to see, well, there were some other parts of Wilson's overall worldview that were not so progressive. And the same could be said about some of the racial attitudes of Wilson, and Coolidge did not confront those issues in a state which had very few African American or black minorities, but he was in favor, and said so publicly, of equal rights for blacks. And a little later on in his career, after he was governor, he spoke out against the Ku Klux Klan and against racial bias and so forth. And so the point was made that some of the people who have gotten credit in history for being great progressives nevertheless had attitudes that made Coolidge more progressive in those areas than is remembered. So that's one thing I think has come out in stronger contrast for me, listening to part of the conference so far.